بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين وبعد. Moving on with our lessons on the Mukhtasar, or introducing the Mukhtasar, we are now going to cover a worksheet which we have made for students, and the purpose of this worksheet is as follows. Essentially, when a student starts reading commentaries and he starts reading footnotes, there is a lot of information. And the reason behind this is because the purpose of a commentary and a footnote is to cover each and every single aspect within a book. Now, just as this is beneficial, it can also be detrimental to a student's growth, because a student isn't able to differentiate between what's beneficial and what is not required at that level. Number one. Number two, a student isn't able to differentiate at times between what that science requires of him versus what another science may require of him. Because the ashab al-Hawashi and Shurooh, they're going to take from all sciences because they're masters in many sciences. They've studied many sciences. So they're going to take from all sciences, and they're incorporate discussions from different sciences as well. And they're going to mention these discussions within their commentaries and within their footnotes. If a student isn't able to differentiate what he requires when reading a fiqh book versus, for instance, what he requires when reading a book on usul al-fiqh versus, for instance, when he requires when reading a book on balagha, he won't be able to properly gain benefit from these books because there's going to be too much information and he won't know what's crucial to the science as opposed to what is being mentioned secondarily. So for instance, if you were to open a book on usul al-fiqh and there is a list of balagha discussions back to back, or if you were to open a book on fiqh and there is a list of lughawi discussions, linguistic discussions back to back, as a student you have to be able to differentiate what is actually relevant to the science I am studying versus what is not relevant to the science that I am studying. And this is why we mentioned to you in the beginning, before we actually begin teaching you sciences, we tell you that there's a mawdu'. Every science has a subject matter. And the reason we explain the subject matter to you is so that you understand when you're studying this science, only focus on this. Do not worry about other aspects. For this level, only focus on this. Now, obviously, this is just indicating or trying to guide you towards what's better for you at this level. Otherwise, it's very difficult. It is difficult for students to differentiate, and let alone students. At times, it's difficult for teachers to differentiate as well. Sometimes you might sit in the class and you will hear discussions that have to do with hadith. You will hear discussions that have to do with usul al-fiqh. You will hear discussions that have to do with mantiq. You will hear discussions that have to do with the Arabic language. Now, those are required in so as much as their relevance to fiqh, because we're studying fiqh in this specific class, for instance. Those are required in so as much as they are relevant to fiqh. So from the perspective of building fiqh upon hadith, usul al-fiqh, the Arabic language, we need that amount from each other science. We don't need the entire science. We don't need the details of each science unless you're studying the science fiqh at a very, very high level. And in that scenario, you might be required to look into the details of other sciences as well. But at this level, that's not the case. So for this level, what does a student need to focus on? What do you need to take back from reading books and from reading commentaries? And like I've mentioned, it's crucial for students at this level and beyond this level to refer to commentaries and footnotes. But you have to know how to refer to commentaries and footnotes, and that is what we'll be discussing today, bi-idhnillah, in the first half of our lesson. Before I mention or I go through this actual worksheet, and we'll show you a practical example. We'll read through some of al-Mukhtasar al-Daruri. I'll just mention over here that there's multiple commentaries on the Mukhtasar. You can flip through different commentaries, see which commentary you like. You can flip through a few footnotes, see which footnote you like. By all means, it's your choice. The commentaries we suggest for students, number one is the footnote itself, al-Mukhtasar al-Daruri. And the benefit of that is that it is accompanied with Sheikh Abu Lubaba's, what we call Bayn al-Sutur. He's added headings, he's added extra benefits, he's made the book more clear because he's highlighted a definition, he's highlighted, for instance, a dhabita, a legal maxim, etc., etc. So in that sense, that book is beneficial. And it's not that hard of a read, as well as the fact that the footnote will take from different books, from al-Jawhara, from al-Fath, from the Hidayah. It'll take from different books. So it'll give you a summary of the discussion at hand. Number two, you can obviously access al-Lubab of al-Maydani, which is the go-to commentary on the Mukhtasar nowadays. It's actually taught as well. if you're accustomed to reading that book. Again, when reading commentaries, there's a lot of stuff that needs to be understood. So if you're accustomed to reading a commentary, or you can get accustomed to it right now, you can open the book, you can get accustomed to reading that commentary. If you want an extensive commentary, Al-Jawharatun Nayyara is there. And in all these commentaries, keep this in mind. I do not expect you to understand 100% of the material, and that is not the goal. Keep this in mind. It's alright if you don't understand everything. If you understand 60% and you're able to, for instance, out of the 60%, retain the 40% that's crucial, that's more than enough. Because a teacher's job, we will teach you and we will help you and we will guide you through this book. Now, obviously, you have to read on your own because you have to create the ability to read. You have to create the ability to access books and to look through books and not just look at the covers and memorize the names. This is something which we see in students a lot. They're aware of curriculums and the names of books, but they haven't studied the books. And this is not that beneficial. You want to study the book itself. So if you're able to understand 60% of the information within that book, for instance, whether it's a commentary or a footnote, and then from that 60%, you're able to take 40% and understand what is crucial from that 40%, that's more than enough. You take that 40%, write it into your notes, and retain it. Now, when you attend the lesson, the teacher will mention, beyond that 40%, the teacher will mention what he deems to be crucial based on your level. And so therefore, sometimes he'll mention things which are not mentioned in the footnotes which you accessed. Sometimes he will mention points which you might not have came across within the commentaries you accessed. Sometimes he'll mention points which when you were reading the commentary or the footnote, you didn't understand. But upon hearing his explanation, it clicks. At times, he will mention a view different than what you find within the footnotes and in the commentary. So in this case, after class, you ask him, well, you mentioned this, but I was reading so-and-so commentary. Could you explain why the author in that commentary said otherwise? And the teacher will explain, bi'idhnillah. If he knows, he will explain. If he doesn't know, he will say, give me some time, I'll look into it, and I'll come back and explain the next day. That's not an issue. So in this method, if you study and you prepare every single day prior to attending class, you look through a commentary, and then you attend class, it'll be much more beneficial. Now, when it comes to attending class, this is important. You have to take notes. We will sometimes summaries will be provided, but notes are crucial for your growth as a student. So do not rely on the summaries. The summaries, if they're there, amazing. If they're not there, that's fine. You as a student need to focus on your notes. And this has two benefits. Number one, it just teaches you to take notes in general, because you're going in your search of knowledge. In your search of knowledge, you're very young, right? This is about 2-3 years into your search of knowledge. So this is the perfect chance for you to learn how to take good notes, and especially with these guidelines or these guidelines, then it'll be much more simpler. Now, when it comes to a lesson, every lesson has different aspects. Some teachers will focus a lot on the hadith discussion, for instance. Some teachers will focus a lot on the usul al-fiqh discussion. Other teachers will focus a lot on the fiqh discussion. Other teachers will focus a lot on tafri'. Other teachers will focus only on explaining the text. They're all fine and they're all good. Do not compare teachers. Do not look down upon teachers. Don't dismiss teachers. Take the good you can. And if you feel the need for more, then by all means study that same book by a different teacher as well. And this is key. This is crucial because we find this in the West quite a bit. The students they begin to dismiss teachers and look down upon teachers on account of the fact that the teacher isn't providing them with what they deem necessary or what they deem beneficial at that given moment. Which is fine. If you're not comfortable, that's fine. But take the good you can. Don't dismiss what they have to give you. Take the good you can. Take proper notes. And then in your free time, access a commentary, listen to other lectures on the very same book, study by other scholars, and you will be able to make up for those points that teacher, for instance, couldn't have or did not give you. Now, when it comes to taking notes, like I mentioned, because every teacher's method is different, you have to take notes in accordance to the method. If you know, for instance, a certain teacher, he will focus on the hadith and extract the fiqh from there. That's fine. That's fine. Write that down. Take notes on that. But then when you study by a different teacher, he might be focusing, for instance, on the qaida usuliyya and extracting the fiqh from there. So you take notes based on that perspective. You study by a third teacher, he might focus, for instance, on just explaining the text. That's all. That's also fine because that's important. So you have to extract that and understand that from there. Again, like I mentioned in the beginning, whenever you study a science, know what your goal is within that science. And based on that goal and what you're looking for, now you can look through all your notes from these different teachers and you can see what is relevant to the science at hand. And if you have a guide or a mentor in this is the best method of studying. So with this, we've covered reading commentaries, footnotes. With this, we've covered taking notes or paying attention in class and taking notes. Finally, the last point is this. not every chapter in fiqh is the same. And this is important to understand. When you study fiqh, the first step is to get a general understanding of the discussions mentioned. The second step is to understand the legal reasoning. The third step is to tie those discussions back into their proofs using qawaid usuliyah, all right, or qawaid fiqhiyah. These are the three steps which a student needs to worry about right now. Get a general understanding. If there is khilaf in the ruling at this level, you should be aware of that khilaf in Qudūrī. Okay, within the madhab, not outside the madhab. Outside the madhab comes later. So at this level, you understand this. Is there khilaf within the ruling, within the madhab? Yes. What is Abu Hanifa's view? What is Abu Yusuf and Muhammad's view? What is the relied upon view? What is the general outlook at the discussion? This is the first step. And if you only have this, if you only take this alone from Qudūrī, it's sufficient. It's all right. The second step is to tie these discussions into their legal reasonings. And if need be, the third step would be to tie them into their proofs with qawaid usuliyah. Because you've already covered Ibādāt, and you have a general understanding of the rulings in Ibādāt, we will be teaching Ibādāt at a higher level. But if you were to try this exact same higher level in uqubat or in mu'amalat, you gain nothing. Why? Because like I said, there's only so much you can digest at this level. So take it easy at first. Start with understanding the discussion itself, the text itself, the different views, and that's sufficient. So in other chapters, you might not have to focus on the legal reasoning. Not because it's not important, because it's your first time studying it. If you were to worry about the legal reasoning or the proofs behind each and every single view, you would end up gaining nothing. Right? Generally speaking, this is what we find within students. When you try focusing on too much, you come out with nothing. And we don't want that. At this level in Ibādāt, it will be taught to a higher degree because of the fact that you've already covered it before. So beyond understanding the ruling itself and the different views, we'll also discuss, for instance, the legal reasoning behind certain views. And in other areas, we won't. If I believe that a certain topic is difficult, if I was to enter into the legal discussion or the legal reasonings behind this certain topic, the student will be confused. Or not confused per se, but there's going to be too much information. He won't be able to digest everything. In that scenario, we won't give him all that information. We will not mention all that information to him because of the fact that this certain chapter is difficult. That's all there is to it. All right. So take whatever you can and take notes, as I've mentioned, and understand that for each chapter in Ibādāt, your approach should be different. This is why we've mentioned to you that when it comes to Ibādāt, I want you to be accessing a commentary or a footnote prior to coming to class. Prior to coming to class, you should access a commentary or a footnote just to get the hang of it. As for other chapters, ask your teachers, is it really beneficial for me prior to class to accessing a footnote or a commentary? Or perhaps it would be more beneficial for me to access the commentary after attending class. And after having understood the general concept and the general outlook, then I can access the commentary afterwards. And in doing so, it'll be easier for me to understand, and my understanding of the book will be complete. This is extremely important, and I believe I've explained thoroughly as to why it is important. The last thing I want to mention is, as a student, it's possible that sometimes you won't understand everything that's being said. And that's fine. The lessons are recorded. You can listen to them multiple times. You have friends who will help you. You can reach out to students in the chat, right? You can reach out to the teachers within the chat. You can ask questions. There's a question tab. You can leave comments if something doesn't make sense. These things will be explained to you. And our job as teachers and instructors is to explain them to you, and we will do that happily. If you don't understand something at first, it's all right. Don't lose hope. Unless the reason you can't understand something is because of your lack of proficiency in the Arabic language, or because you haven't studied any form of fiqh prior to this. In that scenario, once again, it's fine, but you need to change your priorities. Your priorities at this level will now shift over to getting a good grasp of the Arabic language such that you're capable of reading, number one. And likewise, your priorities will shift to covering fiqh at a basic level prior to attending these classes. The last point I want to mention, I've mentioned quite a few points, but this is important because it's guidance as to how to study, is that in our classes, you'll find that sometimes we'll mention qawaid usuliyah. Sometimes we'll mention qawaid of usul al-iftah, like how do you issue a fatwa. Sometimes we will mention, for instance, qawaid of determining the mu'tamad, the relied upon opinion. We will mention qawaid fiqhiyah. You're going to be covering a lot of different things. And we're going to make it very simple and easy for you, bi'idhnillah. However, if you understand the basic ruling and you don't understand the qaida usuliyya in full, it's fine. Because you will study usul at a later time, or perhaps you're studying it right now, or you have studied a primer in usul prior to this. That's actually the ideal setting. That you study the primer in usul either with Qudūrī or prior to Qudūrī. The reason we mention qawaid usuliyya in Qudūrī is to help you apply those discussions you learn in usul. Because for instance, and we find this often, that you find a discussion in usul, if that discussion is not applied, it won't make any sense to you. You'll understand it in the now. You'll understand it in the moment because your teacher explained it well. And you'll understand it because there's a string of examples that are mentioned. But when you're reading a book by yourself, will you be able to apply it? Perhaps you might not be able to apply it because you haven't seen it being applied again and again and again. Just like when we studied Nahu, we teach you theory and then we apply it in practicality. We actually take a book, we take apart that book, we analyze that book, we do i'rab of different sentences within that book, and we build on that in order to teach you Nahu thoroughly. Likewise in fiqh, in usul al-fiqh, we will teach you the rules in usul al-fiqh, and then we need to make sure we apply them at a different science, at a different level, to ensure you understand it well. And the place that occurs will be in fiqh. So in our discussions, we'll be taking from matters of usul al-fiqh, and likewise we'll be giving you a base for qawaid fiqhiyya as well as usul al-ifta. Qawaid fiqhiyya will be taught thoroughly bi'idhnillah later on, using the different books available within the madhab and beyond the madhab as well. And qawaid fiqhiyya is a very important science, but the time for that is not necessarily right now. At this moment, I want everyone to focus on the fiqh, tying fiqh back into usul. And then when we mention qawaid fiqhiyya, like we mentioned in the previous lesson, understand those qawaid fiqhiyya, and you should be able to see how the fiqh is based off of that qaida fiqhiyya. As for usul al-ifta, keep this in mind. Although we will mention usul al-ifta or certain points of usul al-ifta to you, certain points which will help you in finding the mu'tamad, the relied upon opinion, for instance, that does not mean you can go around giving verdicts. There is a big difference between studying usul al-ifta at a low level and actually being capable of giving verdicts. All right, so I don't want anyone to go around giving verdicts or saying that this is the muftabihi, this is the mu'tamad, etc., etc. As far as mudhakara, reviewing knowledge with each other is concerned, by all means, you should review and you should be able to talk to your friends that this is the mu'tamad, this is your friends in these sciences, obviously, in ilm, this is the mu'tamad, for instance, or this is the muftabihi because of so-and-so reason, and this is the qaida usuliyya that governs this ruling, this is the qaida fiqhiyya that governs so-and-so ruling, etc., etc. You should do this. But actually giving answers in the real world, leave this for scholars who have studied for 6-8 years, and then they've covered an ifta course, and then they continue to progress in this field every single day as they answer questions. Leave this for them. Obviously, if you have questions, reach out to your teachers, and your teachers will try their best to help you bi'idhnillah. Now we'll begin with Mukhtasar al-Qudūrī, the worksheet we have created for you. So let's just read through the worksheets first and get a general glimpse of what we're looking at over here. Number 1, if you want the entire discussion along with an example, you can obviously refer to the larger, the Qudūrī files, which we've prepared, which are about 30 pages, in which we introduce Imam al-Qudūrī. We introduce his different books, his teachers. We introduce the Mukhtasar, the methodology in the Mukhtasar, the legacy of the Mukhtasar, and how many different books stem from it, as well as the method of studying the Mukhtasar. We explain all this in about 30 or so pages, bihamdillah, and the previous lessons covered a good portion of this as well. What we'll cover over here is the method of actually applying these worksheets. The first thing you want to understand is every time you have a discussion, a ruling, that discussion plays a role in the chapter. That's why Imam Qudūrī, for instance, is mentioning it within the chapter, right? If it was irrelevant, he wouldn't be mentioning it over here. So generally speaking, the discussion you have at hand plays a role within the chapter. So that's the first thing you want to note down. Where is this discussion coming within the chapter? Okay. And for this, again, like I mentioned, Abu Lubaba will add on certain annotations to help you understand this. So we'll say, for instance, the first bahath, the first discussion is fara'id al-wudu. So you understand over here that Qudūrī's text over here is explaining the fara'id. The next text, for instance, will explain the sunan. The third text, for instance, will explain the fara'id of ghusl, for instance. And then the nawaqid al-wudu. The nawaqid will come prior to the fara'id al-wudu. So you want to make a general outlook of how the chapter will look so that you understand where every discussion comes and why it's coming in that specific area. And over here, if you want, you can even mention the correlation of this discussion to the previous discussion. Sometimes this helps. Like, why did Qudūrī bring Babul Masih al-Khuffayn, for instance, after Babul Tayammum? So Al-Jawhara will tell you that there's a relationship between al-Masih al-Khuffayn and al-Tayammum. So you can write that down in a summarized version. At this level, this is another point. I suggest taking notes in English if you're a beginner student, because of the fact that when you're taking notes in English, you'll be forced to understand the text first and then convert it into your own words. And that will result perhaps in you making mistakes, which is fine, because the teachers will cover that, and later books you'll be able to cover it as well. And at the same time, it'll also help you with is that you'll avoid simply reiterating and copying words and just copy pasting them. You'll actually have to think about it and reiterate it in your own words, as opposed to copy pasting a text in the Arabic language or summarizing a text from the Arabic language itself. But for this practical worksheet, we'll be taking notes in Arabic, bi'idhnillah. But for your own purpose, I would suggest taking notes in English. If you want to take notes in Arabic, that's fine. Nothing wrong with that, but it's just better in the sense that at this level, it's appropriate for students to take apart the text, understand it, and then reiterate it in their own words. All right, number 2, we have to take a look at al-Qudūrī's text. So the first step is just understanding the role in the larger discussion. Now, this can be one line, this can be half a line, because essentially speaking, the role in the larger chapter and discussion at hand, this will be bigger towards the beginning of the chapter, because in the beginning of chapter, you'll mention all the different discussions that will come within the chapter. And then later on, you just mention this is discussion 2 regarding so-and-so. This is discussion 3 regarding so-and-so. So later on, this section will be much smaller in terms of your notes. Qudūrī's text and perception of the ruling, you might find that in certain scenarios, this is very small. In other scenarios, it's very big. Now, I've only given you a few lines over here because I want you to try to understand your perception of the ruling at this level. I want you to understand your perception of the ruling in only a few lines. Why? Because the rule we've made over here is when you study Qudūrī, do it in 2 levels. Number 1, access the matan. And number 2, access the footnotes or the commentary. Don't do it both at once. You access the matan first, and based on your understanding of the matan, try to understand what is Qudūrī saying. That's all. This is step number 2 over here. Al-Qudūrī's text, you write the text down, plus your general perception of the what do you understand from this ruling. After you've done this, after you understood the role this ruling plays in the bigger chapter, as well as your perception of the ruling, now you move on to using the footnotes. And now you're going to build on your understanding, and you might find that your understanding was incorrect, which is fine, because that's what helps you teach. That's what helps you learn. You might find that your understanding was correct, but it was not complete, which is also fine, because now you can complete it in the next section. So now you have a refined understanding using the footnotes. Okay, so the first step over here is sometimes you have important clauses. Qudūrī will mention a text, and because it's open-ended, you'll interpret it in a similar fashion. But in the Hashiyah, he might add certain clauses. He might add certain scenarios. So you want to make sure you make note of that. Are there definitions presented? Perhaps the ruling will stem from a definition. In that case, you also want to make note of that definition. Now, sometimes you'll have definitions which are irrelevant to your discussion. And they're in the Hashiyah, so Mufti Abu Lubaba has written that over them. That is for ta'rif. Same thing as had, right? It just means definition. If that definition is irrelevant to your discussion, you don't have to write it down. Okay. Mention areas of agreement. Why would you say mention areas of agreement? This is what we refer to as tahriru mahall al-niza'. This is important in all sciences. Tahriru mahall al-niza'. Where are the scholars differing? Because if you, for instance, say that in so-and-so masala, Abu Hanifa differs with Muhammad, you might make a mistake in the sense that there are scenarios where they actually agree in that very same masala. And there's just the one-off scenario. If this was to happen, they would differ over there. Now, when you're reading the Mukhtasar, he might mention that one scenario where they differ. And so as a result of that, you will think to yourself, okay, they're differing over here, therefore there's a khilaf. And you write down the khilaf. But what you don't realize is within that same scenario, within that same ruling at hand, if certain clauses are found, they actually agree. In the case that a certain clause is not found, now they differ. In the case that a certain clause is not found, now they differ. This is called tahriru mahall al-niza'. You have to find the areas where they agree and then the areas where they differ. Now, books won't mention it like this. The book will not mention to you they agree on this, and they differ over here. But you'll find this hidden within the wordings. It will be mentioned within the wordings, and you will find it hidden within the text in front of you. You have to read it again and again and try to understand it in order to determine the areas of agreement. And then, is there a difference? You mark that down. You mark down that difference. Then you mention any difference of opinions within the school. and or any difference of opinions between Zahir al-Riwayah and other views. Again, this is all contingent on if the footnote mentions it or not. If the footnote is not mentioning, you don't have to write it down. Because again, you're accessing a footnote at this level. Likewise, oftentimes you'll find within footnotes and commentaries, they mention opinions of other schools. You do not have to write this at this level. You are not required to understand the logic behind the Shafi'i school or the Maliki school or the Hanbali school or even their views at this level. Sometimes understanding their view will help you understand Abu Hanifa's view better. In this scenario, you can write down their view. Not because you're studying their view, but rather because in order to understand Abu Hanifa's view, it makes it simpler for yourself or it makes it easier for you once you understand the other view as well. Sometimes to learn something, you have to learn the opposite. For something to be 100% clear, you have to be aware of its opposite. So in this scenario, if to understand, for instance, the Hanafi view, it would make it easier for you once you've read the text, you realize that, oh, at first I understood something, but once I read Shafi'i's text or the Shafi'i view, I realize that on account of understanding the Shafi'i view, my view of the Hanafiya over here is more clear. I understand what the Hanafiya are saying better. In this case, you can mention the Shafi'i view or the Hanbali view or the Maliki view, which is mentioned in the Hashiyah. But generally speaking, I don't advise this because at this level, you're not required to know this and you shouldn't be focusing on this. The Mukhtasar is taught for students who are studying the madhab at a low level, not necessarily the higher level, although the books that are taught at a higher level all stem from the Mukhtasar, like we explained before. But at this level, you are not required to understand different views. It's sufficient to understand the view of the madhab, as well as to understand the view of the khilaf within the madhab, as opposed to difference of opinions outside or beyond the madhab. Okay. If the mu'tamad or the muftabihi is mentioned or the sahih in the school is mentioned, then you write it down. And this can be two different words. Sometimes you'll find وَعَلَيْهِ الْفَتْوَى وَالْمُعْتَمَدُ قَوْلُ مُحَمَّد. For instance, you'll find this wording. Sometimes you will find, for instance, وَبِهِ يُفْتَى وَهُوَ الصَّحِيح على الأصح. You'll find these different words, and you've come across a lot of these different wordings within Nur al-Idah itself. And we've indicated to them when you say, for instance, على الأصح, that indicates there is a different view in the madhab as well. When you say, for instance, على المفتى به, that indicates there is another view upon which fatwa is not given. Naam. So using these wordings and using your previous knowledge of Nur al-Idah, if it's mentioned within the Hashiyah, make a point of it. Otherwise, you don't have to make a point of it. Finally, and this is important, you can make charts to help summarize the discussion. Okay, this is not necessary, but oftentimes it's much easier to make a chart and to go over the different scenarios in order to understand the discussion. And perhaps you can delay this to the last page, right? You can make this on an extra page just to help yourself understand the entire discussion better. And in this chart, you want to summarize everything that came before. You can summarize everything that's already passed. Oftentimes, you'll find charts are made for you already. Sometimes in certain discussions, within the hashes, he's made a chart for you. You don't have to make a new chart, just copy it. Unless you feel there's a mistake in the chart or it's not that clear for yourself. Then you can make the chart that is clear for yourself. The reason I delayed this, the legal reasoning behind the views, like I mentioned to you, you're not always required to know the legal reasoning if the legal reasoning is presented. Okay, then you can mention. You don't have to go look for it. You don't have to go search for it. If that legal reasoning is tied into a qaida fiqhiyya or a dabita fiqhiyya, write that as well and make sure you give it a certain color. Right? Give it a certain color or pinpoint it using a certain method because this will be a benefit to yourself. Now keep in mind, not every qaida needs to be mentioned. If the qaida is relevant to our discussion, to the ruling at hand, then you mention it. Otherwise, it's possible they're mentioning many qawaid in the footnotes, but it's not relevant to our discussion. You don't have to mention that at this level. Write the qaida or the dabita that is relevant to the discussion at hand. Now, what is the difference between a qaida and a dabita? Generally speaking, the later scholars, they've said that qaida fiqhiyya is something which is relevant through all chapters of fiqh. So, for instance, al-umuru bimaqasidiha. Okay, that an action will be dependent on the purpose for which it was done, which stems from إنما الأعمال بالنيات. This is relevant, they say, through all chapters of fiqh. As opposed to a ضابطة فقهية. ضابطة فقهية is specific to the chapter at which we were discussing. The chapter which we are discussing, that is where a ضابطة فقهية will be relative. For instance, a ضابطة فقهية would be something that's only relative to or relevant to طهارة, for instance, or it's only relevant to, let's assume, salah, or it's only relevant to zakah or sadaqatul fitr. They say that's a ضابطة فقهية. To be honest, both are interchangeable, and you'll find in the earlier books that they've used both interchangeably. But because you're using a book which differentiates between qawaid fiqhiyya and dawabit fiqhiyya, qawaid fiqhiyya will be marked by a qaf, and dawabit fiqhiyya will be marked by a dad. Now let's actually go through an example of this. Let's try to understand this using reading a bit of the text which is mentioned in al-Qudūrī. You won't read everything because, like I said, you don't have to understand the entire text. That's all right. You only need to understand a portion of it. That's sufficient. This is the discussion on those actions which nullify or which break wudu. So a person has wudu and then he does a certain action or a certain action occurs from him due to which wudu will be broken. Let's take a look at what al-Qudūrī says. So like I said, the first step is just to read al-Qudūrī's text. Do not worry about the hashiyah, don't worry about anything else. Only read al-Qudūrī's text. He says, وَالْمَعَانِ النَّاقِضَةُ لِلْوُضُوءِ كُلُّ مَا خَرَجَ مِنَ السَّبِيلَيْنِ. Those meanings. Now this is the first question you should have when reading Qudūrī's text. Why is he saying those meanings which break wudu? That's interesting. That will be in the back of your mind. This question will be in the back of your mind when you read the hashiyah. It will be clear. وَالْمَعَانِ النَّاقِضَةُ لِلْوُضُوءِ. Those meanings which break wudu are كُلُّ مَا خَرَجَ مِنَ السَّبِيلَيْنِ. Everything that exits the two pathways, i.e. the rear passage and the front passage. وَالدَّمُ and blood. وَالْقَيْحِ and pus. وَالصَّدِيد as well as pus as well. إِذَا خَرَجَ مِنَ الْبَدْنِ. When any of these. Why am I saying any of these? Because look, بين السطور is written for you. كُلُّ واحد منهما. When any of these, whether it's blood or pus, exits the body, فتجاوز, and it passes to إلى موضع, to such an area where يلحقه حكم التطهير. The ruling of cleansing this is applicable. يلحق لحق يلحق means to meet. يلحقه حكم التطهير means the ruling of cleansing this is applicable. So, for instance, if a person now, again, general understanding of the mas'ala. Don't worry about details. If a person bleeds, either that blood will extend to an area where he has to wash it or not. Now, what does wash it over here mean? Does wash it mean like if it goes in your clothes, you have to wash your clothes? You can have this question. Keep it in the back of your mind. But what you understand for now is if the blood extends to a certain area where it needs to be washed, or if the pus, for instance, goes beyond to a certain area where it needs to be washed, then in this scenario, this would break your wudu. This says إلى موضع يلحقه حكم التطهير. Okay, now you don't have to understand this fully. It's fine. You're going to access the footnotes afterwards, as well as you're going to refer to your teachers as well. والقيء. Now he mentions another aspect that breaks wudu. والقيء إذا كان ملء الفم. And vomiting when it is a mouthful. Now notice he's marking. Like I told you, Abu Lubaba will mark these aspects for you. And if you notice over here, you'll find that he says the fourth discussion, right, is nawaqidul wudu. And he says, وهي نوعان, it's of two types, حقيقية وحكمية. We're going to discuss this later on in class ourselves, bi'idhnillah, and how we would rather explain this discussion. But for now, we can understand that nawaqidul wudu are something which is actually truly breaks wudu versus something which breaks it in terms of ruling. You don't actually have an impurity leaving the body, but in terms of ruling, it will break the wudu, according to this breakdown. Then he says, النواقض الحقيقية ثلاثة, and he marks them for you. كل ما خرج من السبيلين والدم والقيح والصديد إذا خرج من البدن فتجاوز إلى موضع يلحقه حكم التطهير والقيء إذا كان ملء الفم. These three, according to our understanding right now, are nawaqid حقيقية. Then we have nawaqid حكمية. When and vomiting, if it's a mouthful. Now, إذا كان ملء الفم, if it is a mouthful, what does that tell you? You don't need to access the hashiyah for this. You don't need to access a commentary for this. What does والقيء, vomiting, إذا كان ملء الفم, when it is a mouthful, tell you? If it's not a mouthful, it should not break your wudu. Likewise, in the previous discussion, blood and pus, إذا خرج من البدن, when it leaves the body, what does that mean? Having blood within your body, in and of itself, will not break the wudu. فتجاوز إلى موضع يلحقه حكم التطهير. Just from the text itself, it moves forward to such a place where you have to wash it. Well, what if the blood exits, or it doesn't exit per se, but it simply appears on the area of the wound? It doesn't move beyond that. It simply appears on the area of the wound. It does not move beyond that. Right away, you can understand that because it's not moving beyond. And over here, we're adding a condition that it has to move beyond to an area which needs to be washed. What do we understand from this? That this would not be something which breaks the wudu. So just by reading the text itself, you should be able to understand these points. But again, even if you don't, think about them, ask the questions, and then later on you cover the hashia, they will be explained to you. وَالنَّوْمُ مُضْطَجِعًا أَوْ مُتَّكِيًا, or sleeping, either laying down, meaning you're uh, resting completely, أو مُتَّكِيًا, or resting upon something. Muttakiyan over here, again, you may have a question over here that what's the difference between muttaji' and muttaki, which is fine. Because again, the hashia will answer this for you. أو مستندا إلى شيء لو أزيل لسقط عنه. Or you are resting upon something, or you are leaning upon something that لو أزيل, were it to be moved, لسقط عنه, you would fall down. Okay? This, in these scenarios, wudu will break. Now, النوم مضطجعا, you're sleeping when you're laying down. What does that mean? What if a person falls asleep when he's standing up? Because the author specified النوم مضطجعا, we understand that falling asleep standing up would not break wudu. And we don't need to access a commentary for this. Just by reading the text, this is our current understanding. And likewise, if a person is leaning against something, but it's not in the sense that were that thing to be removed, he would fall. If that thing were to be removed, he would actually stay sitting up. Then in that scenario, this also would not break the wudu based on our current understanding what the author is saying, just simply on his text. Again, this will be visited later on. وَالْغَلَبَةُ عَلَى الْعَقْلِ بِالْإِغْمَاءِ وَالْجُنُونِ. Okay? Or for one, a person's intellect to be overtaken on account of him falling unconscious. وَالْجُنُون, or going mental. وَالْقَهْقَهَةُ فِي كُلِّ صَلَاةٍ ذَاتِ رُكُوعٍ وَسُجُودٍ. And قهقها. Why am I not translating قهقها? Who knows what this means? I don't know what it means. I'm a student. I don't understand what qahqaha means. I have to mark this now because I don't understand what qahqaha means. What does that mean? I have to open a dictionary. Open a dictionary means to laugh. Okay, laughing, but that can be silent laughing. It can be smiling. It can be laughing out loud. What does that refer to? So this section over here, I don't understand it, for instance. I'm going to have to make sure I look at the hashia properly when it comes to this discussion because I don't understand anything regarding this. في كل صلاة ذات ركوع وسجود, in every salah that has a ruku' and a sujood. In every salah that has a ruku' and sujood. Is there a salah that does not have a ruku' and sujood? Don't look at the hashia, think. Is there a salah that does not have a ruku' and sujood? So you'll think and you'll think, and nothing will come to mind. It's alright. Or your classmate will think, and he'll think to himself, wait a minute, I just read Salatul Janazah after Dhuhr Salah, for instance, on so and so person. There was no ruku' and sujood. So kulli salatin that ruku' and sujood is excluding, for instance, Salatul Janazah. If you don't understand this, the hashia will mention it. If you do understand it, amazing. Okay? So at this level, you understood, you read this one text. After reading this one text, what's the first step now? We want to understand the ruling this plays in the larger chapter. So we go back into our worksheet now and we write يذكر. We'll just write it in green. Again, like I mentioned, I want you to write this in English, but it's already for in Arabic. يذكر الإمام al-Qudūrī. You can refer to him as Imam al-Qudūrī. You can refer to him as al-Qudūrī. You can refer to him as al-Musannif, the author. Do not refer to him as al-Matin. Al-Matin, sometimes people, they say that al-Matin refers to the Matan writer. Just like al-Sharih refers to the Sharh, the writer of the Sharh, and Matin refers to the writer of the Matan, but that's linguistically incorrect. You wouldn't say al-Matin. If you want to say the Matan writer, write Sahib al-Matan. So that would be linguistically incorrect, which is why we say don't say it. يذكر الإمام القدوري ويذكر المصنف نواقض الوضوء. Now, why is he mentioning this over here? بعد أن ذكر. This is helping you understand its role in the larger chapter. بعد أن ذكر فرائضه وسننه. The author first mentioned the faraid al-wudu, then the sunan al-wudu, and now he's mentioning the nawaqid al-wudu. How many nawaqid did he mention in general? So now you can count each and every single ma'na which breaks wudu. Right? And he mentioned a few of them. For now, let's say وذكر ستة وذكر ستة منها. Why are we saying six? Because if you're following Abu Lubaba's understanding, he only what's it called circles or number six of them. But if you were to, let's assume you didn't have Abu Lubaba's print and you just read all of them, you can mention, for instance, you mentioned 10 things or 12 things based on how many you count. That's fine. وذكر ستة منها بعضها, some of them are حقيقية وبعضها حكمية, and others are حكمية in terms of ruling. Now, you may not understand what حكمية means, so mark it in red. I'm going to check the hashi afterwards. I'll understand what it means. After understanding that they're حقيقية, some are حقيقية, some are حكمية. Well, what is حقيقية? ما خرج من السبيلين. That was one thing he mentioned. Okay. الدم وال قيح والصديد إذا تجاوز إلى موضع يلحقه إذا خرج من البدن فتجاوز إلى موضع يلحقه حكم التطهير. Again, in English, you want to write all this down. And the last thing you mentioned in الحقيقية, for instance, was نعم, you mentioned والقيء ملء الفم. والقيء ملء الفم. And then in حكمية, over here he mentioned النوم, الإغماء, like if you go unconscious, الغلبة على العقل essentially. And he also mentioned القهقه. Now you've written out the general discussion. You understand what he's saying. Okay. Al-Qudūrī's text and their perception of the ruling. Again, these 2 points, the role in the larger discussion and the perception of the ruling, you can write them together. So you'll notice over here that some of what we mentioned, it falls under the perception of the ruling at hand. قال القدوري, over here you just write والمعاني الناقضة للوضوء. And then in English you can write these things break wudu, and then make sure you pinpoint why is he adding this clause. So you write, for instance, anything that exits the 2 pathways breaks wudu, as well as blood, but the condition in blood is that it has to reach a point where you have to wash it. Okay. Vomit, but the condition in vomit is that it has to be a mouthful as opposed to something which is not a mouthful. And then the author mentioned sleeping, but the condition in sleeping is that it needs to be when a person is laying down, or muttakiya, but I don't know what muttakiya means. So I'll just write muttakiya right now in brackets. I'm not sure what it means. As well as when a person is resting upon another object, were it to be moved, he would fall down. So that means if it wasn't to be moved, if that object was to be moved and he wouldn't fall down, it wouldn't result in his wudu breaking. Or a person is to go unconscious to the point that he loses his intellect or his sanity, or a person goes insane. And likewise, qahqaha, but I'm not sure what qahqaha means. It means laughing in salah. And he added the condition in a salah which has a ruku and sajda, but I don't know if a salah that doesn't have a ruku and sajda, or that means salatul janazah wouldn't be included over here. Again, you're thinking like a student over here, you're writing like a student. Not everything needs to make sense. So you write these things down. And again, the first 2 sections, role in a larger chapter and discussion at hand, as well as the perception of the ruling, you can mix these together. You can mix these together because of the fact that they're close together. They're once you understand the role in the larger chapter, you can write what's it called, your perception of the ruling in line with that. Or Qudūrī's text, you can write it above, and you can merely mention your perception of the ruling or things that point that were important to you. You can mention that over here. Now let's read the hashia. Let's look at the hashia, and let us see exactly what is relevant. So we open the hashia now. And again, when we're looking at the hashia, we're going to start with the first discussion. كل ما خرج من السبيلين. Then we move on to الدم والقيح. Then we move on to القيء ملء الفم. All right. Number 1, he says قوله والمعاني الناقضة. Those meanings. So one of the questions we had when we read the text was, what does meanings mean over here? So he tells you أي العلل. Those reasons. So now we understand that translating al-ma'ani al-naqida as meanings doesn't really make sense. Rather, we treat this as al-ilalun naqida, ay those reasons that break wudu. So now you write in your notes al-ma'ani al-naqida. What are these in reality? Equals al-ilalun naqida, the reasons that break wudu. Now the next section of this text, let's assume you read it. وإنما لم يستعمل المشايخ لفظ العلل احترازا عن لفظ الفلاسفة أو كأنهم اتبعوا السنة فإنها وردت بلفظ المعنى دون العلة حيث قال صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يحل دم امرئ مسلم إلا بأحد 3 معان وإنما استعمل بعض المشايخ لفظ العلل لأنه لم يحترز الاحتراز الذي احترز بعض المشايخ والمراد من المعاني في هذا المقام ما يقابل الأعيان. Let's assume none of this makes sense. None of this makes sense. It's alright. You understood the main discussion that al-ma'ani equals al-ilal. That's what's relevant. The upcoming discussion is just explaining why certain mashayikh use the word ma'ani, why other mashayikh use the word al-ilal. Now, it's possible there's a better reasoning behind this, which your teacher may or may not give to you based on whether he deems this to be important or not. It's possible later commentators on the Hidayah, like Ibn al-Humam, said this makes no sense. You should not be calling it al-ma'ani al-naqidah, because it's not the ma'ani, it's not the exiting itself that breaks the wudu, but it's the thing that exits that breaks the wudu. You don't need to worry about this right now. It's completely fine for you to understand simply that al-ma'ani al-naqidah means al-ilal al-naqidah, and that's sufficient. This next part is important. لما فرغ من بيان فرض الوضوء وسنن ومستحباته شرع الآن في بيان ما ينقضه. Why is this important? What is this telling you? Remember, look back at the chart. Think of the worksheet you wrote. What is this telling me? He's telling you the place the role this plays in the bigger chapter. Because he's already mentioned the fara'id, the sunan, the mustahabbat, now he mentions that which nullifies. Although now we already wrote this. Assuming we had not written this earlier on, we can go back to step number one and we can write over here the role in the larger chapter is لما فرغ من بيان فرائض الوضوء وسننه ومستحباته شرع في بيان نواقضه. And now we've understood based on this text that the role this plays in the larger discussion. And if you want, you can reference Al-Jawhara because he's going to be quoting Al-Jawhara right now. You don't have to reference it. It's fine because it's all taken from the Hashiyah. والنقض متى أضيف إلى الأجسام يراد به إبطال تأليفها ومتى أضيف إلى غيرها يراد به إخراجه عما هو المطلوب منه. If naqd is attributed to bodies, it means breaking their composition, what they're made of. And if it's attributed to something else, it simply means that what does naqd mean? Like if naqd is attributed to an intangible thing, what does that mean? It simply means that that thing is not, it does not bring about the purpose that it was designed for. Okay, now let's assume this makes no sense. It's all right. It's completely fine. Ignore it. But later on, he'll going to mention to you exactly what it means. والمتوضي هنا كان قادرا على الصلاة ومس المصحف. Why are we calling this naqd? Because the person who had wudu, he was able to touch, praise Allah, and to touch the mushaf. But فلما بطل ذلك بالحدث, because now this word over here, al-hadath, right? This is, you have to understand mustalahat fiqhiyah. You've studied fiqh to a degree, so it shouldn't be difficult. Don't read this as bil hadth or bil hadithi or bil hadithi. Bil hadath, what does hadath mean over here? You look in a dictionary, hadath has many different meanings. None of them make sense. You have to think from a fiqh perspective because it's a book of fiqh. What does hadath refer to in fiqh? It refers to a state due to which a person is not able to pray salah. Al hadath al asghar or al hadath al akbar. So based on your understanding of fiqh from your previous books, from Nur al Idah, you should understand that this word over here is al hadath. When his wudu breaks on account of, or when he's no longer able to touch, praise Allah, or to touch the Mus'haf on account of hadath being instead of hadath, انتقضت صفته وخرج عما كان عليه. The previous quality he had is no longer applicable, and he has left that previous quality. That's what we call it naqid. Why is it called naqid? In terms of a body, if we were to call something naqid in a body, means to break it apart. But over here, naqd doesn't mean that. Over here, naqd simply means that what he was able to do, now he's no longer able to do it. Okay, and that's why we translate this as nullifier. This whole discussion you don't need to mention because it's not that relevant to the fiqh of the issue. لا يقال إن الحدث شرط للوضوء فكيف يكون علة لنقضه لأننا نقول إنه علة لنقض ما كان وشرط لوجوب ما سيكون. I don't understand this. It's fine. Nothing wrong with that. Move on. Okay. قوله كل ما خرج. Now the author, now he's going to explain what the author's text is. قوله كل ما خرج. What does he mean by قوله? al-Qudūrī statement. كل ما خرج من السبيلين. Okay, now he's going to explain the statement first. He says, من دأب الشيخ رحمه الله أن يبدأ بالمتفق فيه ثم بالمختلف فيه. This is important. The author al-Qudūrī will mention that which is agreed upon first, and then he'll mention that which is differed upon. This is why is this important? Because you can add this into your general notes. In your general notes, you write منهج الإمام القدوري قال الحداد في الجوهرة النيرة بالمسكون الجوهر over here. نعم. من دأب الشيخ أن يبدأ بالمتفق فيه ثم بالمختلف فيه. This is the general note. It doesn't have to do this discussion per se. It's just a general note. You can add this into your general notes of how to understand the Mukhtasar, and obviously that will be beneficial for you. Sometimes you'll find that he goes against this. If he goes against this, okay, this is not actually something which Quduri followed throughout the entire book. But other times it's possible he wrote in line with this, which is fine as well. And you can make notes of those areas where he wrote in line with this. والخارج من السبيلين متفق فيه على أنه ينقض الوضوء فقدمه لذلك ثم عقبه بالمختلف فيه وهو خروج الدم والقيء وغير ذلك. First he mentions that which is agreed upon, that which exits from the pathways. Then he mentions uh, that which is differed over. Now, where is the difference? You don't need to know. It's beyond the madhahib. Not within our method, it's beyond that. Or even within our method, there is a slight difference. But that's not an issue right now. All right? Blood exiting, vomiting, pus exiting. Some madhahib don't feel that wudu breaks through this. That's why Quduri mentioned it later. Do you have to mention this in your notes? No, you don't. Because it's not relevant to the discussion at hand. Wa'alam, it's a good point in general. You can write this down. It is irrelevant to understanding Quduri and the Mukhtasar in the text? Not necessarily. Okay. واعلم أن كلمة كل وضعت لعموم الأفراد فتتناول المعتاد وغير المعتاد. The word كل ما يخرج من السبيل, everything that leaves the pathway. This includes المعتاد, that which generally leaves it, and that which is not a habit. It just happened to, for instance, an insect was to come out of a person's pathways, or a pebble. Would this break wudu? Well, كل ما يخرج, anything which leaves the rear passage and the front passage will break the wudu. This falls under anything, right? Therefore, it is inclusive المعتاد وغير المعتاد. كدم الاستحاضة, like the blood of استحاضة, والمذي, مذي which is precum, والودي والدود, like an insect, والحصاة, okay, and like pebbles, وغير ذلك, and other things. All of this is included in that which leaves the pathway. So if you didn't understand that first when you read kullu, now you can write, for instance, kullu, underneath kullu, you could write, for instance, and again, summarize. يشمل المعتاد وغير المعتاد. It includes everything. And you can write like a few examples. You don't have to write a lot of examples, just write a few examples. Anything which leaves the pathway. Now again, when you just write this alone, كل equals يشمل المعتاد وغير المعتاد, if you were to look at these notes like 5 years later, they wouldn't make sense to you. So perhaps over here, above كل, or above your English notes, you want to write قوله كل ما يخرج من السبيلين. You understand exactly what you were taking notes regarding. Then you go back to your commentary. Now, and you read ahead. ومفهوم كلام الشيخ كل ما خرج ينقض الوضوء، فهل هو كذلك؟ قلنا نعم، إلا الريح الخارج من الذكر وفرج المرأة. Now he mentions that there is something that doesn't break the wudu. Now you read this entire discussion, and let's assume you don't understand it. It's alright. Just write. All you have to write is يستثنى من ذلك الريح الخارج من الذكر فرج المرأة. Why? I don't need to understand it right now. What exactly is referring to? It's already if you don't understand it. Just write that down. This is an exception, and exceptions you can write in red. Then you move ahead. Okay. Now you read إذا خرج, قيد بقوله إذا خرج احترازا عما إذا أخرج بالمعالجة. If they were forced or squeezed out, فإنه لا ينقض الوضوء وهو اختيار صاحب الهداية واختار السرخسي النقض. If something is to leave by itself, it would break wudu. If it's forced out or extracted out, it wouldn't result in the wudu breaking. The first is, this is the author of الهداية المرغناني's view. And واختار السرخسي النقد. السرخسي, the famous author of المبسوط, he is of the opinion that even if something is extracted, if something is forced out, it would also result in the wudu breaking. You can write this down, but chances are, if you were reading this and it wasn't explained to you, and you didn't have knowledge of previous discussions in this issue, chances are that you would not have realized what this means. You would not have been able to understand what this means, which is fine. Nothing wrong with that. It's completely fine. You can move on, and then perhaps your teacher will mention it. Perhaps your teacher will not mention it because this masla is actually mentioned at a later discussion in the books of Tahara and Ahkam al-Miyah, and there's no need to mention it over here. It's also fine. All right. من البدن قيد من البدن لأن الخارج من السبيلين لا يشترط فيه التجاوز. Now this is important. قيد من, why did he say كل ما that والدم والقيح والصديد إذا خرج من البدن, when they leave the body, فتجاوز, and then فتجاوز, they move on to a point إلى موضع يلحقه حكم التطهير. Why did he mention this? لأن الخارج من السبيلين لا يشترط فيه التجاوز. When it comes to something leaving the two pathways, it's not a condition that they have to pass on to another part in the body, or they have to appear on a different part in the body where you need to wash it. It's simply sufficient for them to appear in their in the rear passage or the front passage. That's sufficient for wudu to break. When it comes to other things in the body, they have to pass on. They have to move on to إلى موضع يلحقه بحكم التطهير. Like if blood was to flow, for instance, it has to flow to an area, another area in your body where you have to wash it. This is our understanding currently. Now, this is a dabita. Do you have to write this as a dabita? Not necessarily. Is this is this dabita such that there's a ruling which is based off of this? You can say yes, there is. What's the ruling? The difference. Okay, now we write this in our own words, right? So, write, for instance, uh, like let's assume like you like make an arrow, for instance, like تنبيه, important point. الفرق بين ما خرج من السبيلين. When did the video end? Just give me a shot if the video ever ends. I never realized the video finished yet. It's fine. Just edit the stuff out afterwards. I'll continue, and then anything that was missed, it's just I think 5 minutes. You can refer back to the recording for it. Now you make an arrow, or not an arrow per se, but any sign, and you write them B. This is an important point, right? Because it helps your understanding of the masala. It's clarifying. It's a qaid which is important. Remember I said that any important clause you should point out. Well, this is an important clause. Then B. الفرق بين ما خرج من السبيلين. The difference between that which leaves the two pathways وبين ما خرج من غير السبيلين, and that which leaves from something other than the pathways. What is the difference? The difference is that لا يشترط أنه, again writing this in English, I'm just reading in Arabic, أنه لا يشترط في الأول الخروج إلى موضع آخر. It doesn't have to, it simply needs to appear. When it comes to when it comes to when it comes to the impurity leaving the body, leaving the two pathways, then in that scenario, the impurity doesn't have to actually move on to another portion in the body, another portion on the body. Whereas when it comes to impurity like blood or like pus leaving any other portion of the body, over there we have a condition. What's the condition? إلى موضع يلحقه حكم التطهير. So it's not merely appearing, it has to actually travel or traverse onto another part of the body. So this is an important differentiation between it, because it helps us differentiate between ما خرج من السبيلين and ما خرج من غير السبيلين. So you write this down. بخلاف أنه لا يشترط في الأول الخروج إلى موضع آخر. Just write آخر to make it easy, right? You don't have to move on to another portion of the body. بخلاف الثاني, as opposed to the second, because it has to move on to a portion in the body where the ruling of purifying it is applicable. And you may not understand this fully, but you've gotten a glimpse of what he's talking about. Something, or you may not understand it at all. You can just make a note of it, like there's an important plate over here, and your teacher will explain it for you. The teacher will explain it for you. Now you read ahead, and you find that the author says, or the commentator, Afwan, or the صاحب الحاشي, he says that the muhashi إلى موضع. Now you explain the statement إلى موضع. Remember he said فتجاوز إلى. What does tajawuz mean? It passes on to another portion in the body where it needs to be. What does passes on mean? حد التجاوز أن ينحدر عن رأس الجرح. It needs to extend beyond the exit point of the wound. So for instance, let's assume you had like a pimple and you pop that pimple, and after popping the pimple, blood or pus, it I'm sure everyone's seen this. If you have a wound or a pimple, you pop it, the blood will come to the top. It'll make like a circle on top. And then if it's strong, if there's a lot of blood, it's going to flow beyond. Now, what does tajawuz mean? What does it mean for it to extend beyond the point? Does it mean that it's simply enough for it to come to the top? Does it mean that it has to extend beyond the point? Let's see what he says. And ينحدر, it needs to extend and رأس الجرح from the رأس. Now, again, this is very it becomes difficult. When you open a dictionary, you find the رأس means head. What does head mean? What is and you open a dictionary, al-jurh, what does jurh mean? So jurh will have 10 meanings. Ra's will have 10 meanings. You have to be able to, based on your knowledge of the Arabic language and studying fiqh, be able to tell that Ra's al-jurh means over here, it means the exit point of the wound. Right? A wound over here is not just an actual wound that's made big, it's also inclusive of, for instance, um, a pimple, for instance, based on the example we gave to you. Then hadara, it needs to fall beyond. And hadara means to fall down, right? It needs to fall beyond, it needs to extend beyond the exit point of the wound. وَأَمَّا إِذَا عَلَى as for the scenario where ala, it grows, وَلَمْ يَنْحَدَرْ, but it doesn't actually fall beyond. This is the first scenario I told you, right? When you pop a pimple, for instance, and the blood circles around. It just circles on top. It makes a circle, or it makes like a circle. Yeah, it makes a circle basically, or it makes a round shape. It doesn't actually flow beyond. لا ينقض. Over here, the wudu wouldn't break. وعن محمد, but Muhammad says إذا ارتقى على رأس الجرح, if it grows to the exit point, وصار أكثر من رأس الجرح, and it becomes larger than the exit point, نقض, then the wudu will break. والصحيح الأول, the correct opinion is number one. Now we have a khilaf. What is the khilaf? How do you define إلى موضع الحق, or how do you define فتجاوز إلى موضع الحق وحكم التطهير? So you go back to your notes and you read this a few times. It's difficult to understand. You read it a few times. It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. Read it a few times. Then you finally write based on what I've understood. I being the student. Right over here. Let's assume you make a star, right? You have to make a star. Just make any. Have like certain signs for the khilaf. Have certain signs for um al-sahih. Have certain signs for would important clauses, just to help you understand the text better. Over here, you make a sign. Let's assume let's make an arrow, and then because I'm writing in red, it indicates there's a masala khilafiyya. Okay, what does tajawuz mean? Ma ma'na at-tajawuz. And then you write ikhtalafu fi. There's khilaf. Now you're going to have two opinions. Ikhtalafu fi. What is opinion number one? You're going to write this in English, obviously, right? It number one, it grows beyond the exit point and it trickles down. It goes beyond the exit point and it trickles beyond it. In Arabic, we would say over here, على رأس الجرح الجرح ثم انتقل عنه or ثم انحدر. It trickles beyond it. This is the scenario where we would say that the tajawuz has occurred and therefore wudu has broken. Why is tajawuz important? Because in out of those things beyond as-sabilain, when they leave the body, it's not simply them appearing that is sufficient in wudu breaking. Beyond appearing, it also has to trickle beyond that point, or khuruj needs to occur. So over here, according to opinion number one, it appears on the exit point and then it trickles beyond that. Opinion number two, you would write وعن محمد أنه إذا لم ينحدر, if it was not to trickle, if it was not to trickle, لكنه صار أكبر من رأس الجرح. It became bigger than the exit point. And you'll find this if you were to pop a pimple again, you'll find that sometimes the blood it circles around, sometimes it's gonna be small, sometimes it won't come out to begin with, and other times it's going to circle, but it'll be bigger than the actual exit point. And you touch it a bit and it'll flow. So إذا صار أكبر من رأس الجرح, this is sufficient. Imam Muhammad said it doesn't actually have to trickle. For it to be bigger than the exit point, this is sufficient. Alright? So do we have khilaf over here? Now what's sahih? The first view is sahih. وهو الصحيح. Because he wrote that in the hashi. وهو الصحيح. So you pinpointed this is the correct view in in the school. And your teacher will explain to you, is there really a khilaf? What's the khilaf? What's the difference? What is the difference between Muhammad's opinion, and we mentioned earlier, of that which leaves the sabilain? Isn't a sabilain? We said that appearance is enough. Isn't this the same thing as appearing? This all will be mentioned to you later on. If it's not mentioned, ask questions, and then it will be clarified for you. Okay. Now you mentioned another far, which is really interesting. ولو ألقى عليه ترابا. This is a very interesting mas'ala because we do this a lot, right? You're about to bleed. What do? You take tissue and you start rubbing it before it flows. So ولو ألقى عليه تراب, someone was to throw, like, dirt over it, okay, or like sand, right, or like something which is in order to stop it. ثم خرج. نعم. فجعل عليه ترابا ولولاه لتجاوز. Were it not for this obstacle which you're using to prevent it, were it not for this obstacle which we were using to prevent it from trickling, it would have trickled away. It would have passed on to another portion of the body. Blood appears, you take a tissue, you dab it quickly. The blood stops. Then it appears again, you take a tissue, you dab it again. Then it stops. You take a tissue again, you dab it again. And you keep doing this. Does your wudu break or not? وَلَوْلَاهُ, were it not for this obstacle, which you're using to stop the blood from trickling, let tajawaz, if the scenario is that it would have extended beyond, it would have actually um, flowed beyond that area, naqada, this will break wudu. Now, this is a very interesting thought. Why? Because based on this, you can understand the ruling of, I'm bleeding, it's a lot time, so I quickly take a tissue and I start dabbing my hand to make sure the blood doesn't go anywhere. Did my wudu break? If that tissue which I used to dab that blood down was such that had I not used the tissue or anything to stop that blood, it would have flown, the wudu will break. If that's not the case, then the wudu will not break. So now you write this thought, which is a really interesting thought, into your notes. And let's assume you don't understand any of the other furu'. It's fine. This is a really interesting thought, and this is sufficient for now. Okay. And then he mentions a few more rulings. Finally, he explains يلحقه حكم التطهير. What does يلحقه حكم التطهير mean? أي حكم هو التطهير والمراد أن يجب تطهيره في الجملة في الحدث والجنابة. That this is such a scenario, a place where it's necessary to wash it either to remove hadath or to remove janaba. Meaning it's fard to wash this area in either wudu or in janaba. What is fard to wash in ghusl? The entire body. If it's fard to wash the entire body in ghusl, if, let's assume, for instance, someone starts bleeding from his arm and that blood trickles down one one small area beyond the area of the exit point itself, that's sufficient for his wudu to break. It's trickled to such a point which is fard to wash. Why is it fard to wash? The entire body is fard to wash. Every single area of skin is fard to wash in ghusl. نعم. يعني يجب تطهيره في الحدث أو الجنابة. Now he makes things easier for you. حتى لو سال الدم إلى ما لان من الأنف نقض الوضوء بخلاف ما نعم. When it comes to doing wudu, right? Or in fact, when it comes to doing ghusl, for instance, ghusl is a better example. It's necessary to take water and put it in your nose. Okay, now where does that water have to reach? So if you touch your nose, you'll find that on your nose there's a harder bone, and then beyond that it's very light, it's very soft. So they say the water has to reach up till the harder bone in the sense that it needs to reach the soft area within the nose. So if someone bleeds to the point that blood trickles down and it doesn't come out of his nose, but it's trickling, he knows it's flowing inside his nose, and it reaches the soft portion. It reaches the soft portion. His wudu broke. Why? Because خرج من البدن إلى موضع يلحقه حكم التطهير. The entire body needs to be washed in ghusl, as well as madmala, gargling needs to be done, as well as istinshaq, water needs to be put in the nose. Where does the water have to reach when you put in the nose? It needs to reach the soft area within the nose. Therefore, blood trickles within your nose to the soft area, it's flowing, your wudu is broken, and you will have to do uh, wudu once again. Okay? Now let's assume you don't understand the second portion. بخلاف ما إذا نزل البول, that's not the issue. واحترز بقوله حكم التطهير عن داخل العينين وباطن الجرح. What does this refer to? Let's assume, for instance, someone has pus within his eye and it moves from one portion of the eye to the other portion. Does wudu break? Is it fard to wash the inside portion of the eye in either wudu or ghusl? The answer is no. Therefore, his wudu will not break. If it trickles beyond the eye, if it trickles beyond the eyelid and comes onto his skin, now we say it's fard for him too. His wudu has broken. He has to make his wudu again. Why? Because لا يلحقه حكم التطهير. The necessity or the obligation of washing that body is not found within wudu or ghusl, that part. So from this, we understand that if blood was just to move from one area in the eye to another area in the eye, or pus, for instance, it wouldn't actually result in the wudu breaking. And likewise, for instance, if someone has a wound and within underneath his skin the blood is moving, it's fine. Because لم يتجاوز إلى موضع يلحقه حكم التطهير. From all this, we understand only one meaning, one concept which breaks wudu. Let's assume, for instance, this is all you covered prior to coming to class. It's fine. It's sufficient. The legal reasoning behind the views in this discussion, you didn't mention any legal reasoning. You didn't mention any legal reasoning, so you leave it empty. When your 10th class, your teacher will mention to you the actual reasoning, legal reasoning. What is the legal reasoning in the Hanafiya? Your teacher will tell you, for instance, خروج النجاسة. And he's going to explain to you how all these things, ما خرج من السبيلين, all right, blood leaving one's body, نوم, that's an interesting one, how they all come back to خروج النجاسة. Your teacher will explain to you how everything comes back to khuruj and najasa. That's the legal reasoning. You wouldn't have covered this in the hashiyah. That's fine. But you come across it in class. And with this, we've covered a practical example of how to understand it. Now, obviously, this is difficult. It's not easy. It takes time, and the beginning is going to take a lot of time, which is fine. You only have 2 classes a week. You have the rest of the week to refer back to these points and to refer to the commentary to understand the commentary. And you don't have to cover everything which will be covered in a lesson. Cover as much as you can. Study for an hour. Study for 2 hours. Right, that's sufficient. Write down what you can, and then attend the class. Take proper notes. Review those notes. The last thing I'll mention before we part is that, like I mentioned to you, we're going to be mentioning a lot of qawaid usuliyah, qawaid fiqhiyah, and qawaid usul al-ifta. So, generally speaking, you want to have a color for each one. So, let's assume, for instance, qawaid al-usuliyah, you have the green color. Al-qawaid al-fiqhiyah, you have the blue color. And then finally, for al-qawaid, qawaid usul al-ifta, you have the red color. As you're reading in class and as you're taking notes, make a chart towards the end of your book, for instance, or on a separate notebook. And in that chart, all you're going to do is write down qawaid usuliyah. Every time a qawaid usuliyah is mentioned, for instance, let's assume tomorrow in class we cover al-amru lil-wujub. Al-amru lil-wujub. You write down the qaida. Al-qawaid al-fiqhiyah, we're going to cover this soon. We've already covered one. Al-ibratu lil-ghalib. Write down that qaida. Al-ibratu lil-ghalib. Okay. Qawaid usul al-ifta, let's assume we've covered it. We have technically mentioned it a few times. Al-fatwa ala zahir al-riwayah. Generally speaking, the fatwa is on the zahir al-riwayah. You just make note of these qawaid which you learn. The reason I'm saying this is because, like I mentioned, we're teaching you fiqh based on these principles. So by the end of this class, I don't want you to simply understand the masail. It's Ibādāt. You have to learn at a higher level. Along with the masail, I want you to have a good base when it comes to qawaid usuliyah, when it comes to qawaid fiqhiyah, when it comes to qawaid usul ifta. And that's not by teaching it on the side. I will apply it and I will show you how it actually occurs within masail. All you have to do is make a note in a separate notebook altogether. Will you just have three sessions, القواعد الأصولية sections, القواعد الفقهية, and قواعد أصول الإفتاء. In القواعد الأصولية, for instance, you say الأمر الوجوب, and then you can write, right? Like for instance, let's assume, where did this come up? It came up in the verse, فاغسلوا وجوهكم. So where does Qudūrī mention that? Qudūrī mentions that فاغسلوا وجوهكم, this verse. Qudūrī will mention it right in the beginning of the book on page number 17 in your nusra. Now over here, you just write صفحة 17. Let's assume later on this comes into play again. Then you're going to add on. Let's assume he mentions it again, or he doesn't mention it. We mentioned it under a mas'ala, which is brought on safha number 18, or not 18 per se. Let's assume 28. Okay, so you just make a point of where the qaid usuli was implemented. Now, number one, you understand the qaid usuli really well, and number two, if you ever have to look where this qaid is being implemented, you have a large amount of examples in front of you, and this will make understanding usul al-fiqh, understanding qawaid fiqhiyah, and understanding the qawaid of usul ifta very, very simple. All right. With this, we've covered how to study the Mukhtasar. Tomorrow, bi'idhnillah, we'll move on to actually beginning with the Mukhtasar, and we'll explain the author's discussion. Bi'idhnillah. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.